Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Apocrypha Apocalypse. I'm Gary Machida, and we are going to look at not one list, but two lists today, although I think it's still going to be a very short video. And what's interesting about these two lists is you'll almost never see them included in popular presentations of Old Testament Christian lists that try to prove the early church accepted only the proto-canon. They're almost always omitted. So we're going to look at them and try to figure out why they are usually omitted. And before we do that, all right, so what are these two lists I'm talking about? Well, the Briennios list and also the Cheltenham list, which also goes by the name of the Mompson list or the Mompson catalog. And both these lists are commonly omitted in popular presentations, popular list of early church fathers who supposedly rejected the Deuterocanon. Well, why are they omitted? Well, let's begin by looking at the Briennios list. This is a fascinating list, although not very helpful. I guess that's how I would summarize it. It was discovered by Philotheos Briennios in 1873. He found it in a Greek manuscript that was copied around 1056. It was found in the Jerusalem monastery of the Most Holy Sepulchre. There's many oddities about this particular list. For example, the books that are listed are given in their Aramaic title and the Greek title. The Aramaic titles are transliterated, or rather transcribed, by Greek letters. Very strange. And also the order of these books is bizarre. In fact, if you look up standard sources that comment on the Briennios list, what you'll find is the word bizarre, strange, odd will occur over and over again in regards to its contents, because as you can see here, the contents of the books is strange. It doesn't match any normal list that we find. It certainly isn't in the canonical order. In fact, when you're reading it, it is a bit jarring, although it does have certain aspects that do mirror one of the lists found in Epiphanius. There is no apparent subdivisions within the list, no clear bipartite division, tripartite division, Septuagintal division. It's really kind of a mess. It only lists the proto-canonical books. It includes the Book of Esther. And that's about it. That's pretty much all we know about it. We don't know who wrote this list. We don't know why the list was written. In fact, there really is no context in which to gauge even when it was written. Scholars place it from early in the second Christian century all the way to the 5th century. Lee McDonald puts it in the middle 4th century. F.F. Bruce, I believe, puts it in the late 2nd century. It's just pure guesswork. Like I said, there are some aspects of it that do seem to fit with one of Epiphanius's lists, but even that doesn't help with dating, because we don't know whether Epiphanius used this list as a basis for his list, or maybe this list was dependent on Epiphanius. We don't know which way dependency goes because we don't know the date. We don't know who wrote it. And specifically for us, as we're going through this series, we're looking at these Old Testament lists and we're trying to pay special attention to the purpose. What were they meant to represent or describe? And also we are looking at coherency. How does the list cohere with the usage in other works by that same author? None of this applies with the Briennios list. We don't know its author. We don't know why it was written. We don't know when it was written. In fact, we really don't have anything substantial to go along with this list. So in terms of evidentiary value, I think this list is practically worthless. Unless we can somehow nail those points down, it just doesn't fit into the overall puzzle. Now, if you want to push me and say, Gary, let's say you have to give your assessment, You have to give an answer. You just can't leave a big question mark about this list. How would I see it? Well, thank you for asking, for one. For two, it seems to fit a basic genre of what we would find with Christians endeavoring to determine which books the rabbis accepted. If you've been following this series, I've been putting forth evidence to show that the early Christians in the 2nd and 3rd century knew that the rabbis had altered the collection of sacred books, but they weren't really sure which books were altered. And I think some early church fathers try to use the New Testament to determine those books, and they were erroneous in that regard. But others try to find out from the rabbis themselves, from Jewish sources, which books they accept, mainly for the purposes of evangelism. And if you see our video on Melito of Sardis, for example, you can see that. You can also see it with our videos on Origen's list, and also his dialogue with Africanus, and also Athanasius as well. These seem to be that type of genre where they're trying to determine which books. So if you had to push me and I have to give an answer, I probably would assign this list perhaps to the late 2nd century, just because it kind of fits within that scheme of things. So it'd be Christian trying to determine what the rabbis accept for Christian usage. I think that would make sense why the Greek names are given and why the Aramaics translated into Greek. It's interesting, it includes Esther, which, as you know, the book of Esther was debated within rabbinical circles for centuries. So its inclusion doesn't necessarily rule out that it's rabbinic origin. It could be. But that's very, very, very speculative, and I would not give it any weight. I think if I had to put this puzzle piece down, I would probably put it in that section there. But that's very tenuous. It could be anything. It could be some sort of speculation about things that maybe are just tangentially related to the contents of the Bible. We don't know. And that is why the Briennios list is usually not included in the list of early church fathers, things like that, done on a popular level for Protestant apologetics. It is very much included in the scholarly works where they try to give a comprehensive view of all the different lists. It's definitely there, but it's placed in different dates. And quite frankly, I think the Briennios list doesn't really give us anything substantial to hang our hat on or to contribute to the development of the Old Testament canon. Not even sure if it's a canon list. But I'm open. Maybe there will be a discovery and we'll be able to put more information along with this list, and we'll be able to fit it more precisely in the overall picture of things. But since we don't know the author, we don't know the context, we don't know the author's usage, we don't know the place of origin, and especially we don't know what the list is supposed to describe. It's just one big question mark. All right, so that's why it's usually omitted in popular use. Let's move to the second list, which is the Cheltenham list, also known as the Mommsen list, sometimes the Mommsen catalog. And that's very unfortunate that it doesn't just have one name, because if you're looking through works, you're looking up an encyclopedia, you want to learn more, it could be in any of those titles. Older works tend to call it the Mommsen catalog. Newer works tend to call it the Cheltenham list. So what exactly is the background to this list? In some ways, it has some similarities to the Briennios list. In other ways, it's very different. All right, so it was first discovered by Theodore Mommsen in 1886. That's when he published this list. He found it in a 10th century manuscript in Cheltenham, England, hence the name Cheltenham list. Oddly enough, the very same scholar, Mommsen, comes across and discovers another copy of this list, this time from the 8th or the 9th century at St. Gall in Switzerland. So we have two main manuscript texts that we can try to determine what the original was. Again, Not very good for textual criticism, and there are some differences between the two, mostly in regards to book order. In both texts, the list of Old Testament books and New Testament books are found at the end of what's called the Book of Generation. The Book of Generation is a kind of Bible aid that traces down the kings and judges down throughout time to the councilships of the Valentinian and Valens reign to the year 365 AD. And we also know that the Book of Generations came from North Africa and also came from a sect known as Donatists. So these were Christians who differed from the church in terms of sacramental and ecclesiastical difficulties. So this is a Christian sect, which St. Augustine was familiar with. So we can date this list to be roughly around the year 365. The list itself may be much older than that, but that's basically the date that we get for this list. So right now you can see how the Cheltenham list is superior in terms of evidence as opposed to the Briennios list. For one thing, we know the context in which it's used. We can determine with some precision the date in which it's made, who had it, and in what location. And also there is other material besides just the names of books in this list. In fact, the list begins with the sentence, "So begins the index of the Old Testament, which are the canonical books." Now, this is important. We've talked about this in previous episodes. With Athanasius is the first undoubted use of the word canon to apply to the books of Scripture. In fact, this list actually is quite early, and this is maybe even the first known use of the word canon in this way in Latin. So this is kind of the Latin equivalent. It's a very, very early use of the word canon. And so it states at the outset that it's going to give us the canonical books. What's different from the Briennios list is that the Cheltenham list gives the name of the book, and it also gives the line numbers of each book. And as it continues on, it will give subtotals. For example, the first subtotal says 7 books, total line 18,100. Then at the completion of the Old Testament, it says all the lines will be in number, lines 69,500. Now, just a word of warning, it's possible that some of these numbers could be wrong and that the totals don't completely come up. So there is some wiggle room in terms of the computation of lines. It includes a paragraph at the conclusion that says, "But as in the Revelation of John, it is said, I saw 24 elders casting their crowns before the throne." Revelation 4:10. Our predecessors show that these are the canonical books and that the elders have said this, unquote. Now, what's strange is that it didn't give 24 books, actually gave more than 24 books in its listing. But so what does this paragraph mean? Well, there's different takes on what it could mean. By the way, the idea of the elders of Revelation corresponding to books of Scripture, we actually see something like this in Jerome in one of his prefaces where he assigns the 24 elders as the 24 books of the Old Testament. Apparently here, this catalog says that the 24 books are actually all the books that are listed, which is more than 24 books. And the difficulty is it's difficult to see how the books can be combined so as to bring up the number 24. So apparently, the author believes that the 24 books mentioned in Revelation, unlike Jerome, include all these books, which include the Deuterocanon. We'll talk about that in a second. Notice it also lists the books of the New Testament as well. And since our focus is on the Old Testament canon, we'll just skip over this information. Usually when you look it up in Protestant sources or any scholarly source, most of the attention's on the New Testament, not the Old Testament. Now, just like the Briennios list is unique, this is also unique. For example, The list entirely omits Ezra. It doesn't mention Ezra or Nehemiah or perhaps other books that fall under the title Ezra. It's entirely omitted, which is very, very strange because Ezra and Nehemiah, it was undoubtedly accepted as sacred scripture by Jews and Christians. So its omission is very odd. And as I mentioned, it also lists among the canonical books 2 books of Maccabees, Tobit, and Judith. In addition to this, there's a couple of ambiguous mentions. For example, it talks about Solomon, but it doesn't stipulate which books would be included under the title Solomon. Traditionally, it would include either 3 books, which would be Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, or it could include 5 books, which would be those 3 books plus Wisdom and Sirach, 2 deuterocanonical books. Now, since it just says Solomon, it's impossible to know exactly whether it was 3 books of Solomon or 5 books of Solomon. According to the line count, it seems likely that more books than the 3 Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs are given, which certainly opens the door to the inclusion of Wisdom and Sirach. And indeed, that's what we find with Augustine and North African councils, that they accepted Wisdom and Sirach. So it is unclear, but it seems likely that it would include those 2 books. The other ambiguous aspect of this list is it just says Jeremiah. If it's Jeremiah alone, then it's omitting the book of Lamentations, which is traditionally combined with Jeremiah. But then again, Baruch and the Epistle are historically combined with Jeremiah. Now, the line count here doesn't really help us to determine whether or not, when it says Jeremiah, did it include Jeremiah Lamentations, Jeremiah Lamentations Baruch, Jeremiah Lamentations Baruch and the Epistle, or any combination of those. It just says Jeremiah. So this list potentially affirms all 7 deuterocanonical books, although we can't be absolutely certain of it. And it applies the word canon to these books. Another peculiarity is that it lists 151 Psalms as part of the canonical scriptures. This is very odd because the many codices of the Septuagint, even though Latin, has a subscript that says that the 151st Psalm is outside of the number of Psalms. And apparently this is missing on this manuscript. So it appears to accept 151 Psalms instead of 150. So what does this tell us about the development of the Old Testament canon? Well, it's significant first that we have a very early list that lists the Deuterocanon as canonical scripture, which is why you don't find this typically with Protestant apologetics where they reproduce the names of early church fathers or list. It's almost always omitted. Why? Because it actually affirms the Catholic canon, more or less. It appears to be listing the books that the Donatists believed were canonical scripture. This list has a lot of affinity with other North African fathers. For example, Cyprian's usage. Cyprian of Carthage used the Deuterocanon as scripture, used it to confirm doctrine. And also, of course, St. Augustine did the same. And this list actually has some affinity with Augustine's list and also with the North African councils. So it just seems to, if you will, push the date earlier than the North African councils by a couple of decades. So therefore, it does have evidentiary value since we know who wrote it. North Africa, sometime around 365, and that it's specifically spelling out canonical scriptures that apparently were accepted by Christians in that place and at that time. So it's a very valuable list. And it's also a list that hasn't received a lot of attention. So I think we'll just park the video right here. It's going to be a shorter video. I hope you enjoyed the contents. I think both lists are very fascinating and somewhat puzzling. So like I said, I'm open to more information. Maybe more information will come to light in terms of the Briennios list, and maybe I can say more on it or change my view. But anyway, if you enjoyed the video, please subscribe, like, tell your friends about us, share these videos. We truly appreciate it. And until next time, God bless.